Hi everybody, welcome to my first YouTube video. In this video I'm just going to go through my standard workflow in Lightroom and Photoshop and show you guys how I got from this to this. There are other things that I do in Lightroom and Photoshop, but I've got a standard workflow that I use generally for each image, and I'm just going to go through that step by step in this video. So I'll get started. So the first thing in Lightroom is I have imported all my pictures and I've selected the one that I'm going to edit. Because I generally post into Instagram, that's the main place where I showcase my images. They've got a very strange crop factor in Instagram, which is 4:5 or 8:10. So I crop to that to start with, and then I'll just adjust it if necessary to wherever I want it to be. So once I've done the crop, the next thing I'll do in Lightroom is I always shoot with my white balance in auto. So I'll choose a white balance. I generally tend to want to warm the images up a little bit. So I generally go, if I've used flash, I might use that one, but I'll have a look through. And for this image, I think daylight, because if I go for cloudy or shade, I think the image just starts to look a little bit too yellow. So I'll just go with daylight and it just subtly warms it up a little bit. The next thing I do in Lightroom is move down to the lens correction. I'll remove the chromatic aberration and I'll enable the profile corrections. Sometimes this brightens up the image a little bit too much for my liking, so I'll just bring the vignette back a little bit, somewhere where I find it pleasing to the eye. And you'll notice the image is quite dark. I usually shoot my images a lot darker than they need to be. That means I can keep my ISO really low, I always try and keep it at 100 or as low as possible. And I find that you can recover the shadows really well in Photoshop. So they're the first few little bits that I'll do in Lightroom, and then I'll bring up the edit in Adobe Photoshop and just wait until my computer decides to get that up into Photoshop, and then I'll start making some more adjustments. So there we go, we've got the image up in Photoshop now. So the first thing I'll do is I'll press Command J to duplicate my background layer. That means if everything goes wrong, I can just delete it and I've still got the original file loaded into Photoshop. And I don't think it needs it with this image, but I usually press Command and 0 and it brings the image to full size in the screen so you can play with it. So as I said, I shot the images a little bit darker, so I'm using a tablet and a pen. It's a Wacom tablet. So I'll bring up those shadows first. So I've got that duplicated layer, and I go to Image, Adjustments, and then Shadows and Highlights. Excuse me. So when this opens up, it comes out to some preset values that I suppose Photoshop believes the image should be. I take all those 6 sliders back to 0, and then I'll just work with the shadows a little bit. So I'll bring the amount and the tone up slightly, just until I'm happy with that, somewhere around there. Now the radius I do often use as well, but it brings contrast back to the image, and I'm not entirely keen on it in this particular photo, so I'll just leave that as 0. So as you can see from that original dark image that we had, I've got that sort of a nice, more evenly exposed, nicely exposed image. Sometimes I do just check the opacity on this one as well. You generally should never have anything at 100% opacity because it can look a little bit too much when you're applying effects and what have you. So I'll just play with that opacity, but in this instance 100% doesn't look too bad. So that's the first step. The next thing I'll do is I'll start to work on the skin. Now for the purpose of this video I'm just going to do the model's face, but I would do exactly the same thing to all the parts of the exposed skin. Now I use frequency separation to do my skin retouching, and I follow a guy on YouTube called Eli Infante. I'll leave a link to his YouTube in the description down below. But he does a fantastic video on frequency separation. He uses it in tons more detail than I ever could do. Because I only post to Instagram, I keep my editing fairly basic. So there's a lot more layers in this free action that I got from Eli Infante than I actually use. But I just use the texture layer to get rid of the blemishes and smooth the skin out a little bit. And then I use the colour layer to even up the transitions in the skin and do a little bit of dodging and burning type stuff in there. So I'm just going to play this Eli Infante action. And this is just selecting the radius of the blur. And you want to be clicking on the skin and then find where it just starts to blur the image. I tend to find somewhere around the 10-ish mark usually works. And it's gone black and white because it's got this helper black and white layer, this contrast layer, so you can see the transitions between the dark and light a little bit easier. But for the first bit, I turn that off, and on the texture layer, I'm just going to grab the spot healing brush and then zoom in. And as I say, I'm just going to do the face, so we'll zoom into the model's face. And this particular model has got really nice skin anyway, so there's not a lot of work to do. But just using the spot healing brush, I'll just get rid of the odd few blemishes that are in there. So I'm going to do this obviously a lot more rushed than what I normally would. I'd normally take a lot more care, and then we can zoom out, and then all the blemishes have been removed from the model's face. I do exactly the same thing on all the rest of the exposed skin. So the next bit is to even out some of these transitions between the dark and the light areas of the skin. So I've got a little, I suppose it's a quick tip, maybe even a cheat. I don't know. I found this again on YouTube a long time ago, but I cannot remember for the life of me where I found it. But if we just zoom into the skin, so on this colour layer, I'm just going to grab the lasso tool and then just make a selection on just a patch of the skin to start with. I tend to do it in sections. And then if we go to filter, blur, and Gaussian blur. And then with this, you've got to be quite subtle, because if you go too far, as you can see, you can completely ruin it. But again, somewhere around the 10 mark, maybe just a little bit over. So we'll just go with 10, but just adjust it till it still looks like skin and it's not gone a completely off colour. And if we just press OK on that, that just evens out some of these transitions, and I'll work on that a little bit more in dodge and burn a little bit later, but it just starts to even it out and just makes life a little bit easier. So again, I'll just do that for this little patch of the model's nose around this area. Just add that Gaussian blurring, and again, just the rest of the face. And I'm doing this really rushed. I'd normally take a lot more time and care doing this. And OK, so if I zoom in, Command and D to deselect, and then as you can see, that's just evened out some of those dark to light transitions and just made the skin a little bit more even to start with. Another thing that I use while I'm on this colour layer is the mixer brush. I find that a very useful tool. So I'll put the contrast layer back on, the helper black and white layer, so you can see the difference between the dark and light. And then in the bottom of the brush menu, you've got the mixer brush tool. Now again, there's plenty of YouTube videos out there that could teach you how to use the mixer brush and what it does a lot more than I can, but it's generally like getting a wet paint brush and then using that wet paint brush to just mix the colours together. So as you can see, under the model's eyes, there's always darker areas, especially when you've shot and the light's coming down from above. So what you can do is with this mixer brush, just drag some of this lighter colour up just to get rid of some of that darker area. And again, just little bits on the model's forehead, just even out these transitions and just make that a little bit smoother. So as you can see, even with the black and white layer, if we turn off that, the transitions in the face to what we've got now are much more nicer, even and smooth. So that would be about it for the Eli Infante frequency separation action. So I can press Command 0 to get back, And then what I'll do is I'll just merge these two layers together just so they become a little bit neater. And I will then use the another action that I got from another YouTuber, Jessica Kobeissi. This is a dodge and burn action that I found from her YouTube channel. Again, some fantastic tutorials over there, so I'll put another link to her channel in the description. But if we play this contrast layer action, it gives you the black and white helper layer again. Just group those in together. And then we've got a highlight, which is the dodge, so to make things lighter. And then we've got a shadow, which to burn things to make them darker. So I'll just work on the model's face, move in. I'll play this highlight action, and it's just a curves layer, and it's been preset up. So if I grab the brush, and if you need to reset the brush back to black and white, it's already, make sure you're on the layer mask selected and you've got white selected, and then you can just brush on in darker areas just to, again, lighten them up and just even out those areas in the skin tones. And I tend to find that do this in little stages, so play lots of the highlight action and do it in little bits, and then you can also adjust the opacity of that if necessary. So as you can see, if I bring the opacity back, we've got that dark patch, and then just bring it up and bring the opacity up so it looks nice. Excuse me, so it looks nice and even. So I'll do that for the entire face, and I'll do it with a few highlight layers, a few shadow layers, and just make that whole area of the face look nice and even. And that, once you've done with all that, once you've done all the dodging and all the burning, you can get rid of that group layer because you don't need it anymore. Bring that group layer away and delete it. And then the next thing that I'll do is I'll use some selective colour to adjust the skin tones if necessary. So the skin tones live in red and yellow. So in the reds, I'll generally maybe tend to darken it up a little bit to give the model browner looking skin. Play with all the sliders very subtly and just adjust the tones of the reds and the yellows just to give you the skin tones that you want. I'm not going to sit and play through them at the moment, but that would be the next step that I do. So when I've got the skin tones looking nice and even, got them the right colour, the next thing I'll do is a global dodge and burn to the image. So dodge and burn the entire image. And again, I think this may be another little lazy / cheating method, but another one that I learned on YouTube from somewhere. So Command, Option, Shift and E, and I believe it's Alt rather than Option on a PC. I'm using a Mac, and that gives you another layer. And then Command, Shift and U desaturates it, puts it into black and white. So when that layer's in black and white, change the blend mode to soft light. Oh, wrong one there, soft light. And then this is where the little trick comes in: filter, other, and high pass filter. And if you set the radius of the pixels somewhere around the 160-ish mark, just do it until it looks right to your eye. You can see that that has darkened all the darker areas and brightened up all the brighter areas. And then what we'll do with that is take the opacity right down, so that's where we started, and then just bring it up until you're happy with where you've got the dodge and burn. So that's just a very quick, easy way to do dodging and burning. I've tried to do dodging and burning over the whole image with the curves layer and stuff like that, and I just find it too much work for me. So that's just a nice, easy way to give you a little bit of a dodge and burn effect. What you can also do with that, if you wish, is add a layer mask to it. So again, if there's any areas that you don't want to be affected by that, you've got a layer mask, and then we can just paint with black. So grab the brush. If we press X, it swaps the black and white around, and then if we just paint with black, that would take that effect away from that area. So I'll just leave that as is for now. And then finally, the last little bit that I would do in Photoshop before I take it back to Lightroom and just finish off is colour grading. Now, I know there are many ways to color grade images, gradient maps, split toning. I've got a few actions saved which I downloaded from various places. For me, I tend to find I like the results best if I use color lookup tables. So color lookup tables are just in this little end of the adjustments menu. The first thing I do with this is adjust the opacity down to about 40%, somewhere around there. The effect, if you play it immediately, it looks far too much. So I take the opacity down to around 40%, and then you get a much better idea of what you actually want it to look like. So personally, there's a few that I like in here, depending on what style of image I'm going to go for. I generally tend to like the warmer ones, so such as like Candlelight Cube. These are all preset, loaded into Photoshop. Soft warming's usually a nice one, but for this particular image, I am going to go with this one, Kodak 5218-2395. No idea what that means, but that's the one that I like. So once you've put that colour lookup table on, you can see that's just warmed up the image ever so slightly, and then I'll just fine tune the opacity of that to where I like it. So that's it. And then that's it in Photoshop for my standard workflow. So I'll save this and take it back to Lightroom and just do some final little adjustments just to finish off. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to merge the layers just to tidy it all up a little bit, and then File and Save. And that's saved. When the image is saved, that then should load up into Lightroom with these Photoshop adjustments that I've put in. So back to Lightroom, and we'll just wait for that image to appear. This is the one that I'd finished editing before, and then this is the one that we've just done. So computer's been a little bit slow. There we go. So this is the one that I've just been working on in Photoshop. So now I've got it back into Lightroom. The first thing I'll do is I'll grab an adjustment brush and set it on texture. And again, I'm just going to do the model's face, but I would do this for all the skin. Back that out a little bit. And then if I press the O key, then when I paint, it gives me that overlay so I can see where I'm painting. And again, I'll do this a lot neater usually, take more care and time. But press O again to remove the overlay, and then I'll just pull the texture back a little bit, not too much, so it looks like the model's just got absolutely no texture to her skin whatsoever, but just pull that back ever so slightly just to give that nice, smoother, more magazine style portrait effect. So we'll fit that back. So when I've done the texture on the skin, I want to use some radial filters. So the first one I'll do is I'll put a big radial filter around the model, around the subject, should we say, depending on what your image is, and invert it. And then we want to darken, so it's like putting a vignette on, but not just in the corners. It does the whole of the image, and it just makes the model pop a little bit. And you can adjust the feather on that depending how you want that to be. And then again, I'll just grab a new one, and this time I want it to be on lighten, and I'm just going to bring the model up in the image. Oh, don't want to rotate it. Bring that in. There we go. And then just again, just brighten the model however you want, just till it looks good to your eyes. And then I'll have a final little play with any of the adjustments. So just do I want to bring the shadows up a little bit, bring the light, bring the blacks back, add a little bit more contrast. Depends on what style your image is shot in, how you want it to look. But I'll just have a final play with these sliders, and then I'll just work my way down the Lightroom toolbar. I know there is a lot of stuff you can do with a tone curve, and there is stuff that I have done in the past, but these days I generally tend to leave it alone. Do sometimes play with the HSL panel, adjusting the hue, saturation and luminance of some of the colours. Split toning, tend to do my colour grading in Photoshop, so I have played with the split toning before, but not very often. Sharpening the image, because I usually shoot with a low ISO. For example, in this image 100, I generally put it to around 70 and then mask it off. Oh, that's the detail, sorry. Mask it off just so the eyes and the lips are sharp and nothing else. So mask that off with 70. Lens corrections we already did when we add it into Lightroom beforehand. Vignette, sometimes add one. Don't think for this image it needs one. I kind of like it a little bit brighter around the edges. And then again, color calibration. I do sometimes tend to play with the color calibration. Generally the saturation, not the hue. I don't tend to like the results when the hue's adjusted, but for me, just a little bit of adjustment in the saturation does work. And that's it. That would be a finished image with my standard workflow. So depending on the image, there could be a lot of other things that I would play with and that I would adjust. So if we go to that image that we started with, and then that was the one that we've just edited, and the finished article. So hopefully some of that's been useful, and found it a little bit informative, and I'll catch you guys later on. Take it easy.